By devoting just 6 minutes each weekday for 1 year, you can read through the entire New Testament using David's servant's daily devotional, HeavenWord Daily. Order your copy at heavenword.tv.
Well, thank you so much for joining me once again. We are back in Matthew chapter 21 as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament. And we just looked at Jesus' cursing of this lone fig tree. I did my best to explain that there was a logical reason for Jesus to be disappointed, at least, that this fig tree had nothing on it. Now, the second little problem that we have with this story is that Matthew's account indicates that the fig tree withered at once, whereas Mark's account indicates that at least no one noticed it until 24 hours later. Mark describes Jesus and his disciples going to Jerusalem in the morning, as does Matthew. Jesus investigating this fig tree to get a little bite to eat, cursing it, and Matthew says the fig tree withered at once, whereas Mark says they continued on, spent the day in Jerusalem, came out that night, and then it was the next morning as they walked by that same fig tree when Peter noticed it and said, wow, the fig tree which you cursed has withered. And so, how do we reconcile that apparent discrepancy between these two accounts? Again, I'll say this much, as I've studied both the Gospels, Matthew and Mark, of course. Mark is much more sensitive to the chronological factors, putting things in their chronological order. Matthew is no slave at all to chronology, and that comes out clear just in this little story of Jesus' triumphal entry and the cleansing of the temple and the cursing of this fig tree. And so the way that I reconciled that apparent discrepancy, that alleged discrepancy, I should say, is that we read very clearly that when Jesus saw this fig tree in a distance, he went over to it to see if he could find anything on it. So he was some distance from the disciples, and that he cursed it, and no one noticed immediately that it began withering at that point in time. It began withering, to some degree. Jesus came back, and they walked all the way to Jerusalem. When they came back that night, it was evening, it was late, perhaps it was dusk or dark. No one paid attention to it, no one could see. It was the next morning in the daylight when it was noticed. But the fact of the matter is that it didn't take 24 hours after Jesus cursed that fig tree, right? When Jesus said, may no one ever eat fruit from you again, that was curtains for that fig tree. And so I tend to think that, as it's reported by Matthew, it did wither at once, and that's brought out in the story. It may have continued to wither. I think we can safely assume that it eventually just died, right? It withers, and it withers more. When things die, they get worse and worse, and they wither more and more, and then they die. So the next day is when the immediacy that occurred the day before was noticed a day later and brought up by Peter. And he said, hey, this fig tree that you cursed, it's withered. And Jesus then makes these astounding statements that we're about to read. Now, I want to just handle one final little aspect before we move on to Jesus' words about speaking to mountains and making them move. And that is something I've already touched on, the deeper significance of what's going on here. I mean, come on. Why would Jesus curse a fig tree just because he couldn't find any fruit whatsoever on it? I mean, just go on and leave it alone. There must have been something he was trying to teach. And I think the answer to that is best found in Luke's gospel. Not how Luke describes this particular incident, but a parable that Luke records that Jesus told about a fruitless fig tree. Okay, you're probably familiar with it. Can I read to you from Luke chapter 13 and verse number 6 and a couple verses after that? He began telling this parable. A man had a fig tree which had been planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and did not find any. And he said to the vineyard keeper, behold, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree without finding any. Cut it down. Why does it even use up the ground? And he answered and said to him, let it alone, sir, for this year too, until I dig around it and put in fertilizer. And if it bears fruit next year, fine. But if not, cut it down. So there's a parable that illustrates the tension between the mercy and the compassion of God versus the holiness and the righteous judgment of God. And I hate to use the word tension because that makes it sound as if God is debating within himself, but maybe he is. I mean, those two things are in opposition one to another, right? Mercy, the Bible one time says, triumphs over judgment. So it depicts it in using words of war. Mercy triumphs over judgment. So there is this tension there. And this parable, I think, shows that tension. This fruitless fig tree deserves to be cut down. Why is it using up the space? That's what judgment would say. That would be righteousness. It doesn't deserve to stay here because it's not bearing any fruit. I could plant something else and get some profit from it. But it's the vineyard keeper who represents the mercy of God, saying, no. Let's just give it one more year. Let's dig around it. Let's put some fertilizer. Let's encourage it. Let's prod it on. Let's see if we can turn this fig tree around to produce some fruit, and then we'll be glad we didn't cut it down. And I think that is a microcosm of what is happening in God's heart and mind all the time relative to everybody, right? Particularly those who have not repented. God, has to make a decision between, do we end it all for this person? Do we cut their life short? Do we stop them from their sin and harming others? Or do we show them mercy, giving them some time to repent? Because maybe if we give them more time, maybe they will turn around. Maybe if we prod their conscience and dig up around it and fertilize their conscience a little bit and fertilize their life a little bit to have them reap what they sow so they can understand how their sin offends others and offends God, maybe that will get them thinking and turn them around. But back to the original story we're talking about here in Matthew chapter 21, clearly it was time for judgment to be pronounced upon Israel for the rejection of their God-sent Messiah, right? Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's the clear, obvious, deeper meaning of what's going on here. And this fig tree just serves as an object lesson of what's going on in all of Israel under the ministry of Christ. I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.